Welcome back to the FIDE Women's Candidates. We are in round 7, and the race for the top is tightening dramatically. Anna Muzichuk sits alone at the top with 4 points, but a massive chasing pack of 5 players are all tied at 3 points, meaning a single decisive result could completely reshape the standings. The pressure is real, the stakes are enormous, and today we have one game that produced a full point. Let's get into it. Vaishali Rameshbabu is a dynamic, aggressive player who loves creating imbalances and pressing for the initiative. Zhongyi is a former women's world champion known for her solid, resourceful defensive play and in-game technique. Both players entered this game on 3 points, meaning a win was critical for either to apply pressure on the leader. This was a must-play battle. The perk defense is a hypermodern opening where black allows white to build a strong center before striking back at it. It has been used at the highest levels by players like Tigran Petrosian and more recently Timur Rajabov. The structure typically leads to complex middle games with opposite side or delayed castling plans, and white often pursues a king-side attack, while black counterattacks in the center or on the queen side. The most popular first move in chess, staking a claim in the center immediately and opening lines for both the bishop and the queen. White signals aggressive intentions from the very first move. Black opts for the perk defense, a hypermodern choice that invites white to occupy the center with pawns. Rather than fighting for the center immediately, black plans to challenge it later with pieces and the eventual pawn break with e5 or c5. White accepts the invitation and builds a broad pawn center. This is the principled response, occupying both e4 and d4 and forcing black to find a plan to undermine these pawns, developing the knight while immediately attacking the e4 pawn. This is the most common move in the perk, putting pressure on white's center and preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop on g7. Solid, slightly unusual developing move. Instead of the classical nc3, white places the bishop on d3 where it supports the e4 pawn and eyes the kingside. This is a quieter setup that avoids the sharpest theoretical lines. Black strikes back in the center immediately, challenging white's e4 pawn. This central counter is one of the key ideas in the perk and opens up the position, though it also gives white a target on d6 if the pawn advances. White reinforces the d4 pawn, preparing to maintain the central pawn tension. The c3 pawn creates a solid foundation and also supports a future bc2 retreat if needed. Black develops the queenside knight to d7, a flexible square that keeps the c-pawn mobile and prepares to challenge the center. The knight on d7 can later hop to f8 or c5, depending on how the position develops. The bishop retreats to c2, tucking away safely and keeping watch over the e4 pawn from a more sheltered diagonal. This setup resembles some King's Indian attack structures and prepares a kingside expansion. Black prepares to fianchetto the queenside bishop, a thematic idea in these structures. The bishop on b7 will put pressure on the long diagonal and help support the center from a distance. White routes the knight to e2, keeping the d-file clear and planning to bring the knight to g3 or f4 to support a kingside attack. This is a patient, maneuver-based approach. The bishop lands on b7, completing the fianchetto and immediately exerting pressure along the long diagonal toward e4. Black's setup is coming together smoothly. Second knight heads toward the center, intending to swing to f1 and then e3 or g3 to bolster the kingside. White is building up slowly but methodically. Black prepares to fianchetto the kingside bishop as well, a classic perk formation. The g7 bishop will become very powerful, pressuring white's center and potentially the queenside. White castles kingside, connecting the rooks and tucking the king to safety. The position is still quite complex. With both sides completing their initial setups, the bishop arrives on g7, completing the double fianchetto setup. Black's 2 fianchettoed bishops bear down on the long diagonals and create a very solid defensive structure. White launches an ambitious kingside pawn advance, gaining space and opening lines toward black's king, which will soon castle short. The engine actually considers this slightly committal, as it weakens the e3 square and the pawn on e4 needs careful attention. Black castles into the kingside pawn storm, which looks risky but is actually quite typical in these perk structures. Black is confident the center will provide enough counterplay. The knight hops to g3. Eyeing the f5 square and supporting the f4 pawn, white is building kingside pressure piece by piece, a clever bishop maneuver, stepping out to a6 to target the f1 rook after it eventually moves. Black is probing for counterplay on the queenside while also potentially trading off the bishop pair. White transfers the rook to the third rank, a standard preparatory move for doubling rooks or swinging the rook to the kingside. The rook on f3 can shift to h3 or g3 to increase pressure. Black relieves the central tension by capturing on d4, simplifying slightly and opening the e-file for the rook. This exchange makes sense given black's active pieces. White recaptures with the c-pawn, restoring the central pawn and keeping a strong presence in the middle of the board. Black immediately challenges the d4 pawn with a queenside break. This is the consistent follow-up, aiming to undermine white's center and generate queenside counterplay. White advances with a space-gaining pawn push, kicking the knight and seizing territory in the center. The pawn on e5 is a powerful outpost, restricting black's pieces. The knight retreats to e8, a somewhat passive square but necessary to free the f6 square and keep the position together. Black is regrouping under pressure. The bishop centralizes to e4, a powerful square where it supports the advanced e5 pawn and eyes the h7 square. White's pieces are beginning to coordinate dangerously. Black activates the rook on the c-file, targeting the backward c-pawn and adding pressure to the queen side. This is a healthy developing move that keeps the rook useful. The rook swings to a3, an unusual move that seems to be preparing to lift the rook to b3 or possibly a more aggressive file. White is maneuvering creatively. The knight retreats all the way to b8, a deeply passive move, but black is repositioning to free the d7 square and potentially reroute the piece more usefully. White sacrifices the exchange, giving up the rook for the bishop on a6. This is a positional gamble, destroying black's defensive structure and eliminating the powerful bishop pair. White gets a pawn and open lines in compensation. Black recaptures with the knight, which looks natural, but the engine flags this as a significant inaccuracy. The knight on a6 is immediately offside and will struggle to rejoin the game. The pawn structure and piece activity now strongly favor white, with the bishop on e4 dominating and the knight stranded on the rim. The bishop swoops to b7, a devastating move that forks the rook on c8 and the rook on f3 area while also attacking along the long diagonal. White's pieces spring to life immediately. Black saves the rook by retreating to b8, also blocking the bishop's diagonal temporarily. This is a defensive necessity. White captures the stranded knight on a6, winning a full piece for a rook and gaining material advantage. The exchange sacrifice has paid dividends. Black pushes the b-pawn to gain space and activate the rook on b8. This is queenside counterplay, trying to generate something before white's extra material tells. White immediately challenges the b5 pawn, refusing to allow black easy counterplay on the queen side. The queen activates aggressively to a5, attacking the bishop on a6 and putting pressure on white's queenside pawns. Black is fighting back. White captures the b5 pawn, and now the bishop is protected and black's pawns are further weakened. Black recaptures with the rook, activating it and giving up the bishop for a pawn. The position is still complex, with material roughly balanced on paper. White plays the knight to b3, attacking the rook on b5 and the queen on a5 simultaneously. This looks like it creates a discovered attack theme, but the engine actually marks this as an inaccuracy, slightly releasing black's defensive bind. Black captures the knight on b3, a massive tactical decision that the engine condemns as a blunder. By taking the knight, black gives up a rook for a knight and walks into a losing position. The rook on b3 will simply be recaptured, and black will have surrendered too much material for insufficient compensation, with the passed pawns on a4 and the active white pieces proving decisive. White recaptures with the queen, winning a full rook for a knight. The material advantage is now significant. Black captures on d4 with the pawn, gaining a passed pawn and trying to create counterplay. However, this also opens lines that benefit white's active pieces. The engine considers this another inaccuracy, as the newly passed pawn is not as powerful as it appears given white's coordinated pieces. White captures on d6 with the pawn, winning a pawn and keeping the advanced passed pawn. The d6 pawn is now a monster in the heart of black's position. Black delivers check with the queen, but this turns out to be a critical mistake. The queen is actually very well placed on a5 or elsewhere to create threats, but moving it to e1 hands the initiative entirely to white. The engine sees this as a major inaccuracy, as the queen check achieves very little while allowing white to consolidate with tempo. The knight blocks the check on f1, a calm defensive move that maintains all of white's advantages. The knight is well placed here, defending the king. Black captures the passed d6 pawn with the knight, recovering material and activating the knight. However, the engine marks this as another inaccuracy in a long sequence of mistakes as black's position remains fundamentally lost. The queen retreats to g3, eyeing the g7 bishop and preparing to consolidate. White is slowly tightening the grip. Black shifts the queen to e2, maintaining pressure and trying to activate. The engine considers this another inaccuracy in what has become a cascade of suboptimal moves from black. White exchanges queens with this move, and simplification into an endgame actually favors white, who holds the material advantage. Black advances the passed d-pawn aggressively, hoping the pawn's promotion threat will create counterplay. The engine marks this as another mistake, as white has sufficient resources to deal with the pawn while advancing the kingside majority. White blocks the passed pawn with the bishop, a calm and strong defensive move that stops the d-pawn in its tracks while keeping all winning chances intact. The knight leaps to e4, an active central square from which it attacks the queen on f2. However, this is yet another critical mistake. By jumping to e4, black trades the knight for the queen on f2 via the queen exchange, but the resulting endgame leaves black with a rook versus white's bishop, which is clearly worse given white's pawn structure and active king. White captures the queen, and now the queens have left the board. The endgame that remains is clearly better for white. Black recaptures on e2 with the pawn, creating a threatening passed pawn deep in white's territory. This pawn on e2 is an annoying resource. The knight goes to g3, keeping an eye on the e2 pawn and maintaining pressure. Black activates the rook to e8, threatening to support the promotion of the e2 pawn. This is the most active defensive try. White captures the knight on e4, simplifying further and eliminating black's active piece. Black recaptures with the rook on e4, keeping material on the board and maintaining the e2 pawn as a weapon. The king marches toward the e2 pawn, a critical move to neutralize black's main trump card. Black grabs a pawn on b2, expanding the material collection. The b2 pawn is a nice bonus, though white's overall advantage remains clear. White's rook goes to e1, directly targeting the e2 pawn from behind and setting up to win it back. Black captures the a4 pawn with the rook, winning another pawn and creating a passed a pawn. Black is collecting material, but the in-game coordination remains difficult. White recaptures the e2 pawn with the rook, eliminating black's most dangerous asset and restoring order. Black activates the bishop aggressively to f6, threatening the g3 pawn and keeping pressure on white. White repositions the rook to c2, a flexible central square from which it can defend or attack depending on black's next move. Black advances the h-pawn, creating a passed pawn on the kingside and adding another resource to the position. The king steps to f3, centralizing actively and preparing to march toward the queenside to deal with black's a-pawn. The a-pawn advances toward promotion, black's most dangerous outside passed pawn that demands white's attention. The rook goes to c6, attacking the bishop on f6 and maintaining active play. Black's king moves to g7, stepping behind the pawn mass and defending the g6 pawn. The rook swings to a6, directly attacking the a5 pawn and preparing to stop black's most dangerous passer. Black retreats the rook to a1, abandoning the a-pawn and stepping into a devastating losing position. This is a massive blunder. With the rook leaving the a-pawn undefended, white simply captures the powerful bishop on f6 with the rook, winning a piece for free and transforming a complex endgame into a completely won position. Black had to keep the rook active to maintain any defensive chances. White captures the bishop on f6, winning a piece for nothing. The position is now completely won for white. Black checks on f1, a desperate attempt to create some counterplay, but this check is easily met, and the engine confirms this is yet another mistake in an already lost position. The king sidesteps to e2, evading the check calmly and leaving black with nothing. Black captures the rook on f6 with the king, which is forced but represents yet another mistake as the king steps into a horrible pawn endgame. White's extra passed f4 pawn, combined with the bishop versus nothing, means black is simply lost. White captures the rook on f1, and we have reached a bishop and pawns versus pawns endgame that is completely winning for white. Black's king marches to f5, an aggressive king move trying to attack white's pawns. However, the engine marks this as another mistake as it fails to challenge white's best plan. The king retreats slightly, a precise defensive response that avoids allowing black's king to make progress. Black's king advances aggressively to e4, stepping right into the center to fight for the f4 pawn. But the engine considers this another inaccuracy, as white's bishop provides sufficient defensive cover. White advances the g-pawn, supporting the f4 pawn and beginning to create a dangerous pawn chain on the king side. Black pushes the a-pawn forward again, trying to create a second front and force white to divide attention. The engine marks this as another mistake, as the a-pawn alone cannot compensate for white's dominant bishop. The bishop moves to c5, a magnificent square from which it covers the a3 promotion square and keeps the a-pawn under control. Black advances the h-pawn, creating a second passed pawn to further complicate white's task. The engine sees this as yet another mistake, as two passed pawns still cannot overcome the bishop's dominance. The bishop pivots to e7, a brilliant repositioning that simultaneously attacks the g5 and f6 squares while keeping both black's passed pawns under surveillance. Black captures on g3, trading the h-pawn for the g3 pawn. This creates a new passed pawn for black, but the engine views this as another inaccuracy that does not fundamentally change the evaluation. White recaptures on g3, maintaining the g3 pawn while keeping the position in complete control. Black's king marches toward the queen side, trying to support the a-pawn's advance. The engine flags this as another mistake, as the king is walking away from where it needs to be to stop white's pawns. White's king advances to f3, marching toward the center and preparing to support the f4 pawn advance. Black pushes the f-pawn to f5, creating another passed pawn, but this is yet another mistake, as it actually helps white by reducing pawn pressure and allowing the king to advance more freely. The bishop repositions to f8, targeting the g7 square and keeping both black's g6 and f5 pawns under pressure. White's bishop is incredibly versatile. Black's king moves to d3, continuing the march toward the queen side. The engine considers this a mistake, as the king is too far from the critical kingside action. White's king retreats slightly to g2, a precise move that keeps the king centralized without allowing black's a-pawn any tricks. Black's king advances to e3, right into white's territory. The engine marks this as another mistake in a long series, as the king is heading toward the f4 pawn, but white has precise defensive resources. White's king moves to h3, a deliberate sidestep that keeps the king safe while maintaining control over the critical squares. Black's king attacks the f4 pawn directly from f2, another inaccuracy from black in this long in-game struggle. White's king advances to h4, heading toward the kingside pawns with tempo. This is a powerful king march. Black's king continues fighting, but this too is flagged as a mistake. The king is dancing around but cannot prevent white's decisive pawn advances. White plays the bishop to d6, a decisive redeployment that blockades black's f5 and g6 pawns simultaneously. The engine marks this as slightly inaccurate, preferring an immediate king advance, but white maintains a dominant winning advantage. This was a game decided by a series of compounding errors from Tan. After a complex and relatively balanced middle game, the turning point came when the rook retreated to a1, allowing white to capture the bishop on f6 for free. From that moment, Vaishali converted a bishop and pawns in game with excellent technique, advancing the f-pawn and maneuvering the bishop to decisive effect. Massive result in round 7 as Vaishali closes the gap on the leader. The standings are tighter than ever, with Muzychuk still ahead but the entire field breathing down her neck. Round 8 promises to be explosive. Let us know in the comments how you think this tournament will unfold, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, please subscribe for full coverage of every decisive game.